to Ethics Now, a production of Penn State's Rock Ethics Institute. I'm David Price. Today, we'll be joined by Dr. Ben Jones, political scientist, ethicist, and the assistant director of the Rock Ethics Institute. We'll be talking about ethics and policing in the United States, racial disparity in the use of deadly force, the slogan, Defund the Police, potential corrections, and ethical expectations of police in the United States. Dr. Jones is widely published around the issue of policing, including a forthcoming co-edited book called The Ethics of Policing: New Perspectives on Law Enforcement. Okay, let's get started. Ben, thanks very much for being here. We appreciate it. So what got me thinking about having you on this program was a presentation that you gave just a couple of weeks ago to Penn State School of International Affairs, the ethics of addressing racial disparities in police deadly force. And we'll circle sort of around to that, I think, but I'd like to start off with a broader view, and that is, what ethical principles should be guiding police and public safety at this point?
For me, the principle that I start out with is the prioritization of protecting life. And so when you actually look at use of force policies by police, you often find that that's the first principle to start off with, that police are there to protect life. That is their number one priority. And so I think what we've found, especially since Ferguson and the killing of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, we find that so many police policies in place don't live up to that ideal. And so it's really thinking about how can we make that ideal actual policy and practice. And I think in addition to that, you have to take into consideration the history of policing. Policing has been complicit in racial oppression throughout US history, and it has to be proactive in addressing that and making sure that those, it isn't continuing to advance that history.
Many cans of worms to open up the program, and I can unfortunately only ask one question at a time. And you mentioned Ferguson. Ferguson was Missouri with the police killing of Michael Brown, which prompted a lot of protest at that time. Comparing the protest at that time to the protest that the killing of George Floyd earlier this year prompted in Minneapolis, it seems, and the statistics seem to point this out, that the public did not embrace the Ferguson protest to a great degree. And yet they did seem to embrace and demand change as a result of the George Floyd protest. What changed between then and now, do you think?
I think it's something you see often with social movements, is that they build, you don't win right away. It takes time to sort of build support, communicate your message. When Ferguson happened, there was a lot of information that we just lacked about the police. We had no idea, we didn't have good data on how many people are killed by police each year. The data that's been kept by government sources was wholly inadequate. And so what you found was that after the killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson, you had much more attention on this issue. You had media organizations developing databases, keeping close track of killings by police. And, I think when Ferguson happened, there was this reaction of, at least by some, this is an aberration, this isn't normal, this wouldn't happen in our community. And then you had much more attention on this issue, much better much more research, and the movement that was working to bring attention to these issues and the racial disparities in policing and the violence that oftentimes communities of color face from police, they continue to do the difficult work, even when the media attention, the news cycle would move on to something else. You still had sort of organizers working to bring attention to these issues. And when it would come back up in the news, you know, able to marshal more resources and really bring attention to say, these are systemic problems, and there is compelling data that things need to change, that police are failing our communities in a number of ways, and that without systemic change, that this cycle is just going to continue on. So we've learned a lot since Ferguson. There's still a lot more work to do, but I think you've seen the debate change as there's just been better research, more attention on the issue.
Ferguson was 2014. Here it is, almost 2021. So roughly 7 years ago. What's changed in policing since Ferguson? Has anything changed?
There have been some changes, not enough. I think I think a lot of the proposals that are being considered and implemented today were just not taken seriously 6 or 7 years ago. So, I mean, after George Floyd, you see states implementing bans on chokeholds, requiring changes to police training and practice. And you do see in some big city police departments where they have taken a more proactive approach to address training and make sure that police aren't using bad tactics that unnecessarily endanger life. You have in some of those departments seen some positive results in terms of fewer deadly force incidents. Now, I don't think in many of those cases there's still much more work to do, but there are some places in the country that you see some progress. And I think what's really been important with the most recent wave of protest in response to Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and others is thinking about policing and public safety in a much more holistic way, and thinking about what are the social determinants that lead to violence, that lead to these incidents with police, and recognizing that police reform is part of what needs to happen, but that these underlying issues, lack of services for mental illness, poverty, homelessness, that these are all issues that we have to tackle if we want to address the issue of police violence and making sure that communities are safe.
It's definitely a non-linear issue. It's not just knock down one thing and something great happens. You wrote an op-ed with an associate here in the Rock Ethics Institute, Eleanor Brown, that appeared in the Philadelphia Inquirer, and in it you note that many of these acts of violence on part of the police are consistent with, or defended as being consistent with, policies and procedures. It seems like the police, whether it's through a fault of their own or through no fault of their own, are trained to respond to given situations in X, Y, or Z manners, and that a way of fixing one of the many ways is at the very beginning with the education of how to be a police officer and what to do in a given situation. That's one. Is that a right perspective that I'm drilling on here?
Yeah, I think so. And so, there oftentimes when we see these incidents of questionable killings by police, or ones that may be frankly illegal, one reaction is they're bad apples, and that's the explanation for it. But I think what your question gets at is that there are these more systemic issues about how police are trained and how they respond to violence and various calls that they get. And I think a really focusing on a few examples perhaps is best to illustrate this. So in the United States, police kill oftentimes hundreds of people a year who have knives, aggressors that have a knife. And how they respond to those incidents is radically different than how police in other countries respond to those incidents. For instance, in the UK, many officers do not have a gun. They don't carry a gun. And so if they respond to someone who has an edged weapon or a blunt weapon, they're not going to shoot them because they don't have a gun to shoot them. And so they've been trained in radically very different tactics in how to respond to that situation, tactics that are much better at protecting life and being able to resolve that incident without having to resort to deadly force. Now, there have been some police organizations and some police chiefs that have been have welcomed these sorts of reforms and try to implement them in their agencies. But for the most part, there's generally been resistance to it, and so you see, whether it's the case here in State College, the killing of Osaze Osagi in 2019, or the shooting of Walter Wallace Jr. in Philadelphia, which happened more recently. Individuals who had a history of mental illness and had a knife with them. A lot of people see these incidents and they say, "Isn't there a better way to resolve it?" And for so long, the police were like, "No, we followed protocol. We're trained. If someone gets close enough to us with a knife or a club, that we're supposed to shoot." And when you take a more comparative approach and you look at how police handle these sorts of situations in other places, it's clear that deadly force isn't necessary and that there are approaches, but to be able to get to a place where police aren't using deadly force in those situations, there needs to be major changes in how police are trained and what the expectations are.
They are not trained mental health experts. They are not psychologists. They are not psychiatrists. And yet, increasingly, almost endlessly, it seems like, we call on our police officers to handle mental health issues when they are not trained to do so.
Yeah, and I think that police will always need some training in mental health issues. I don't think they're not going to be mental health professionals, but they do need some training in those issues, just given the nature of police work. But I think one important discussion that really came out of the protest in 2020 was, should police be handling all these calls? Are there calls where other professionals would be better suited to respond, that have a wealth of knowledge on mental health issues, how to respond to someone who's experiencing a mental health crisis? And so you actually see some alternative approaches where you have, there are police that can respond if someone's violent or they have a weapon. But you also have trained crisis teams that can handle a lot of these calls, and you don't send police. And so you don't have, an armed policeman, and, if the situation escalates, can lead to a deadly result. Instead, you have people that are better trained in interacting with folks who are experiencing a mental health crisis. And so I think that is an approach that definitely deserves more attention. It's something that here locally is being looked at. There was, after the shooting last year of Osaze Osagi, there was a mental health task force that was formed, and part of its recommendations was to consider putting in place locally in State College individuals with that training that can respond to some of those calls. So it'll be interesting to see how that continues to play out and if that ends up being implemented.
Also coming out of 2020, the protest after George Floyd was the slogan and the concept, "Defund the Police." It was embraced and touted, and even in Minneapolis, I mean, they went along and did some defunding. I'd like to get your impressions of the wording of defund the police, uh, because it says some things pretty clearly to me. Defund means take away the money,
Mhm.
all of it. Defund, zero them out. That doesn't seem helpful. In fact, that seems very risky. Your impressions of defund the police, and is it the best way to say these things?
So there are a couple things to address. One is the protest that resulted from George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and other incidents. It changed the conversation, and I think in many important ways. And one of them is thinking about, when we want to improve public safety, is policing the only tool in the box? And part of the protest movement was saying that this is not the only tool in the box, that we need to think about a more holistic approach. And I think that was one of the principal motivations behind that. And it was also, um, you know, confronting, especially like you look at, a number of different police departments across the country, sort of histories of racial bias and abuse of communities of color, and a real lack of legitimacy for good reason for the police in certain communities. And, I think sort of those two things together, motivated much of this sort of movement to defund the police. Now, like a lot of movements, they evolve in different ways. And you actually saw in the 2020 election, you saw a number of initiatives that were successful in putting more resources to other initiatives that are critical for public safety outside the police. And those initiatives, the language sometimes looked different, and so the language was reallocate resources for public safety. And I think what that communicates, which is important to realize, is that when you're putting money towards crisis intervention teams, towards services for mental health, towards homelessness, that these are all packaged together. These are all part of efforts to improve public safety. And if you sort of have the language of, okay, funds are being reallocated but they're still going towards public safety, I think that communicates an important point. Um, and like a lot of issues in politics, how things are worded, people react very differently to it. And I think as this work continues forward, it's important to make the argument of public safety involves a lot of different variables, and we have to take this holistic approach to improving public safety. And I think the more that can be communicated, I think the more success there'll be.
House Majority Whip Jim Clymer of South Carolina was recently very critical of the sloganeering around defund the police, and in his estimations, as it cost the Democrats some seats, including the senatorial race in his South Carolina. And now there's a big fight, of course, among the Democrats as to what do we do with this slogan and how does it fit everywhere. You mentioned the holistic, and you've got a book that you've edited with another associate in the Rock Ethics Institute, Eduardo Mendieta, coming out, The Ethics of Policing, New Perspectives on Law Enforcement. I don't want you to give away the whole thing, of course, but I imagine that when you're talking about this holistic approach to solutions, that they're embedded in that book, and what are some of the things that are being suggested to fix it? We've talked about a couple, but otherwise.
Yes, that book addresses a wide range of issues, and we're really fortunate to have some top-notch contributors to it. Folks like Tracy Mears at Yale Law School, she served on President Obama's 21st Century Task Force on Policing, or Task Force on 21st Century Policing. Franklin Zimring, who's a leading criminologist, he wrote a very important book called When Police Kill, which looked at deadly force by police in the United States as well as other countries. Veshla Weaver, who's a leading political scientist at Johns Hopkins, and has done some really important work looking at communities of color, their perceptions of the police, how their outcomes vary dramatically in terms of how they experience police and the criminal justice system. So we have some great contributors to that book, and they're part of it's looking at sort of more narrow issues like police use of force, and how do you what sort of interventions are successful at being able to reduce police deadly force. You have other contributions that look at broader questions like the legitimacy of police. How do you what does police legitimacy look like in a democratic society? There's some important pieces in there about racial disparities in policing, and sort of how different movements have emerged to push back against that and what successes they've had. And then there's some historical essays as well as essays about police technology. And when we think about policing, this is an institution that has been around for quite a bit, and that legacy stays with us. So law enforcement was involved in the slave patrol and Jim Crow and lynching, and sort of how does that history color our perceptions of policing today, and what are the ethical responsibilities of police to address that. And then obviously, like, technology is changing. So police are using drones, they're using predictive analytics, and these are raising a host of new ethical quandaries for public safety and law enforcement. So those are also issues addressed in the book.
It is holistic and it is expansive, and it's going to be very much on President-elect Biden's desk when he finally takes office here come January. I will also mention, before I wrap things up, that you've got another book coming, Apocalypse Without God, Apocalyptic Thought, Ideal Politics, and the Limits of Utopian Hope, which is not about police reform, if I'm correct, right? That's utopian theory. So we're going to have to rejoin you on that one, I believe.
It is timely, though, right? Given all the apocalyptic stuff going on in 2020.
Indeed, yes. And I was just, there was something that came out recently that confirmed that dinosaurs were doing real well until they got hit by an asteroid. So, apocalypse is just around the corner. So we'll be rejoining you with that book probably sometime in 2021.
Sounds great. Thanks so much, David.
You bet, Ben. Ben Jones, the Assistant Director of the Rock Ethics Institute. We appreciate you being here. For the Rock Ethics Institute, this has been Ethics Now. I'm David Price.